Okay, I hope everybody's doing well. This is the first video lecture in the course where we're going to do the kind of what is blank thing, what is philosophy, right? A lot of introductory lectures. The very first lecture in a course starts off with kind of a basic introduction to what the discipline is and what the course is like, and we covered all the course requirements and syllabus and administrative issues in our live session. And here we have the first pre-recorded lecture to kind of give you an idea about what we'll be studying in this course and how we'll be studying it and how we'll be thinking about, at least a little bit about how we'll be thinking about the issues that we study in this class. So people show up to philosophy class with all sorts of different ideas, sometimes mistaken ideas about what the course will be like, what they'll be studying in the course, or and it often shape their expectations about what they think is going to be required of them in the class. So it's probably a good way to start off by thinking about exactly what we'll be doing, or to give you a better idea of what we'll be doing in this class.
And his great-grandpa was Thomas Griffin, a great philosopher.
Thomas, would you please go look for a job?
Why?
That's not what we're going to be doing in this class. We're not going to just sit around and ask why questions by themselves anyway. I'm never going to write why up on the board or ask why in a video lecture and then accept why not as an answer or something like that. We're going to be doing something very different than that. So if you were to Google the definition of philosophy, here's the first result that you might get, right, or are likely to get. So here's a lexical or dictionary definition of philosophy: the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. And of course, that's what we're here in an institution of higher education to do, is to consider these various areas of studies as academic disciplines, right? We're in again an institution of higher education or higher learning. We're here to develop a deeper and broader understanding of the subjects that you may have studied before, or like, which is probably the case with this class, to be introduced to a new discipline. Most of the time, philosophy is not taught, at least in America, as in primary or secondary schools. That's not always the case, but it is often the case. So there's our first definition of philosophy. Then, of course, the first one discusses it as an academic discipline and lists off some of the main subfields of academic philosophy. So I'll come back to those in a little bit. Another way we might think of the term philosophy is as a particular school of thought, right, or a particular system of thought that has particular views about the nature of knowledge, reality, existence, or morality, and those sorts of things. That's certainly what we'll be up to in this class. Another lexical definition here is the study of the theoretical basis of a particular branch of knowledge or experience. The degree PhD means Doctor of Philosophy, and although you can get a PhD in many, many different disciplines, what that reflects, what that title reflects, the title of that degree reflects, is the deepest, most thorough level of learning in that area of study, where you're not just worried about what you need to know in order to practice it, but the theoretical basis or the theoretical problems involved in that area of study. And then lastly, here we have a theory or attitude held by a person or organization that acts as a guiding principle of behavior. You may have thought or had in mind that last definition of philosophy when you heard about this class, maybe, or were thinking about the course, or maybe that's the way your friends or family members that you know talk about philosophy. But that's the least accurate definition for our purposes. We're not going to just sit around and not just study your particular beliefs and attitudes. Higher education is about being exposed to lots of different viewpoints, right? And that's what we'll learn to do in this class, much of what we'll do in this class, and learn to think about and critically evaluate those different attitudes and beliefs. So the two most important lexical definitions of philosophy for our purposes are that academic discipline definition, a particular school of thought or system of philosophical thought. Those are the ones that are most important for us. And of course, many of you have probably heard of Socrates before, maybe Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, the three big ancient Greek philosophers, right? One way of thinking about philosophy is as the unexamined life is not worth living. That was Socrates' claim. He thought the unexamined life was not worth living. And philosophy he thought of as the examined life. So this ancient Greek notion of philosophy is the examined life. That's thinking of philosophy more in terms of as a way of life, right? Where we spend reflective and engaged in critical and reflective thought about things. But again, we're considering it as an academic discipline, right? So there are lots of examples of the unexamined life in pop culture. We're going to use a lot of pop culture in this class as examples or a source material for thinking about different philosophical issues or illustrations of basic philosophical points. And there are lots of examples, of course, of the unexamined life in pop culture. You get this a lot with Homer or Peter Griffin, where the humor of those shows revolves around the fact that they're not particularly reflective individuals, or maybe Randy Marsh on South Park, that kind of thing. But we're looking, again, at philosophy in terms of not just the examined life, but as an academic discipline, right? So you see a little bit of that notion of philosophy as the examined life in South Park, but usually illustrated through Kyle and Stan, who are much more critical thinkers in the show, right? And so one of the first articles that you've probably been assigned in this class is a South Park and philosophy article that discusses Kyle and Stan as examples of philosophy and as pop culture as a philosophical, in terms of philosophy, right? And so surely there are many episodes of South Park that are basically toilet humor. Some of them literally have to do with toilet humor. But other episodes are more satirical, provoke the audience to think through, or show characters giving particular arguments or reasons for and against various ideas that can be considered philosophical ideas. And so not all of pop culture is just mindless entertainment, right? So now we can start to think a little bit more seriously about philosophy as a discipline, and what are the activities that philosophers understood as practitioners of this discipline up to. Well, here's Epictetus, a quote from Epictetus, who was an ancient Stoic philosopher, that gives us a little bit more of a thoroughgoing definition of philosophy. So just the etymological definition of philosophy, what does that word mean? It means the love of wisdom, right? So certainly an acceptable way to think about what's going on in philosophy as a way of life, and it does overlap with philosophy as an academic discipline. But this passage here gives us a little bit more to think about. So he says, behold the beginning of philosophy, a recognition of the conflict between the opinions of people, a search for the origin of that conflict, a skepticism regarding it, and a kind of investigation to determine whether the opinion is rightly held. In our media-rich and media-saturated environment, it's not hard at all to recognize the conflict of different opinions between people. And then he mentions here a search for the origin of that conflict. So what are those people really disagreeing about? What's the fundamental issue? What are the basic stakes in that disagreement? Sometimes people appear to disagree and initially think they disagree, but once they start clarifying what exactly their idea, what their idea is, they find that they're not necessarily in disagreement, right? And so we have to have a skepticism regarding that apparent disagreement to find out if there's a real disagreement there. And then this last part is very important, a kind of investigation to determine whether the opinion is rightly held. And we're going to spend the first part of the class worrying about rightly held opinions and proper reasoning. That's why we're going to study basic logic at the beginning of the semester. And we'll get into a little bit of that at the end of this lecture. Although if you don't get it right away, that's okay, because we're going to come back to these notions in much more detail the rest of this first section of the course, right? So I always tell students that it's easy to have an opinion about something. Remember that last definition, that last lexical definition or dictionary definition that we just saw of philosophy was an attitude or belief held by a person. Sometimes people get the idea that philosophy class is just about, or they have the idea that philosophy class is just about expressing your feelings or your beliefs or your attitudes, but that's not really what we're doing here. That's not really what we're going to be up to. We might begin there, but that's not where we're going to end, and that's certainly not where we're going to stop. We're going to try and figure out as best we can whether the opinion is rightly held. So it's easy to have an opinion or an attitude or a gut reaction, or to be engaged in gut thinking, or what Colbert calls truthiness, right? Some other references there to reading assignments that you're going to have or may have already had. We're going to worry about whether the opinion is rightly held. And so we'll study, again, some basic logic there. Those are going to be, those principles of logic that we study and critical thinking that we study are going to give us our rules of argumentation for this class. All right, so now a little bit more of a contemporary take on the academic discipline of philosophy here from Simon Blackburn. He's a contemporary thinker. Has produced many, many works of academic philosophy, including a couple of introductory textbooks. And so this comes from his book, Think, a Short Introduction to Philosophy. And here's what he says about philosophy. He says, the word philosophy carries unfortunate connotations, impractical, unworldly, weird. We saw some of that reflected in that Family Guy clip from the beginning there. He says, I suspect that all philosophers and philosophy students share that moment of silent embarrassment when someone innocently asks us what we do. I prefer to introduce myself as doing conceptual engineering. Just as the engineer studies the structure of material things, so the philosopher studies the structure of thought. Understanding the structure involves seeing how parts function and how they interconnect. It means knowing, or whether, we could add there, whether they disconnect, right? Where they fall apart, where they fail. Engineering as a discipline is concerned about addressing certain engineering problems, right? Breakdowns in machines and how to fix them and correct them. So let me continue here then. He says it means knowing what would happen for better or for worse if changes were made. This is what we aim at when we investigate the structures that shape our view of the world. Our concepts or ideas form the mental housing in which we live. And then he goes on, we might wonder whether what we say is objectively true or merely the outcome of our own perspective or our own take on a situation. Thinking about this, we confront categories like knowledge, objectivity, truth, that we may want to, and we may want to think about them. At that point, we are reflecting on the concepts and procedures and beliefs that we normally just use. We are looking at the scaffolding of our thought and doing conceptual engineering. Right? And so all of us, right, we make claims and have assumptions about what counts as knowledge, right, or truth, right? Oftentimes we don't think about that notion of truth or knowledge itself. We just use that idea often unreflectively or maybe uncritically. Well, in this class, we're going to start thinking about and try to develop the habit of thinking about those concepts that we often just use and employ. So that's what I mean by a deeper level of analysis there, right? So if you were to trap me somewhere at a cocktail party or something like that and ask me for my own definition of philosophy, here's what I would probably say if you got me to talk about it at all. I would say that philosophy is the critical, reflective, and well-reasoned inquiry into an attempt to address the fundamental conceptual questions of the human condition, right? The idea of how to define philosophy precisely is itself a philosophical problem. This is one of the things that makes philosophy a little bit frustrating and annoying sometimes. And so, although I don't think we're going to come up with, for our purposes, certainly a completely satisfactory definition of philosophy that pins down what philosophers would want to call the necessary and sufficient conditions of philosophy. We can do better and develop a working definition of philosophy that's better and more informative than just the love of wisdom, right? Or the examined life, right? And so here's the textbook that I'm probably having you read from for the most part of the semester uses this definition. And so this will be our working definition of philosophy throughout the semester, whether you're in my introduction to philosophy class or in my introduction to ethics class. This will be our working definition. And again, there are some problems that if we really wanted to, we might pick at with regard to this definition, but it's going to be our working definition from here on out. And it's got several components to it. So attempting to discern and remove contradictions among non-empirical, reasoned beliefs that have the universal importance with the resulting benefit of achieving a greater understanding of the world and our place within it. You can see some similarities there between Blackburn's take about what philosophy is conceptual engineering, and even the love of wisdom or Epictetus's notion of what philosophy is. And so here let's think for a moment just about the key elements in this definition. So the first is attempting to discern and remove contradictions. Well, a contradiction are two opposing, two exact opposite beliefs, right? I'll give it first an empirical definition, an empirical or scientific claim of example of a contradiction. My name is Chris Blakely. I'm the instructor for this course, and as you can see, I am bald. Right, I shave my head. I shave it because I don't like the wraparound look very much for myself, so I shaved the whole thing. But I'm a bald guy. I have male pattern baldness. Right. If you didn't know who Chris Blakely was, you had no idea what that proper name referred to, you still would know at least one thing about Chris Blakely, namely that it can't be the case that Chris Blakely has a full head of hair, of natural hair, a full head of natural hair, and is bald at the same time and in the same respect, right? Now that's an empirical example, and what I mean by that is that we can observe, if we find out who Chris Blakely is, we can observe him and figure out which of those propositions is true about him. Does he have a full head of hair, or does he shave his head and have male pattern baldness? But the way we would answer that question is through observation, right? We would go look and find Chris Blakely, which Chris Blakely are we referring to, and then figure out which of those propositions accurately describes him. But that's an empirical example. It's something we can figure out just through observation of the world. But I want to point out that even if you couldn't observe me, you couldn't look at me, right, that you would still know one thing about me, that it can't be the case that he's both bald and has a full head of hair at the same time and in the same respect. So philosophy deals with non-empirical beliefs. That means beliefs that look like, no matter how much evidence we get, even if we had total scientific evidence, that evidence itself would not settle the issue. And I'll come back to some examples of those sorts of problems there as well. So philosophy, what distinguishes it from the sciences, for example, is that the sciences, either the natural sciences or the social sciences, the human sciences, that they deal with observation and hypothesis formation about the observable world, right? But philosophy doesn't seem to address those the sorts of questions and debates that philosophy is dealing with don't seem to be resolvable through observation of the world alone, at least in principle, no matter how much evidence we get. So for example, I'm never going to observe a supernatural being, right? So figuring out whether there are any supernatural beings doesn't seem to be just a matter of observation of the world, right, or of nature. Some empirical evidence might be relevant to figuring that out, and some arguments for God's existence work that way. Some other ones don't. But it's not. But there, even when it is relevant, even when the empirical evidence is relevant, we're using that evidence to try to infer the existence logically of a supernatural being from what we can observe. Right? It's not like we're observing the thing itself. So questions about free will, many questions about morality, many questions about the nature of the human person. Is the human person all physical or only physical, or do I have a non-physical mind or soul? those are non-empirical questions, right? And then there are reasoned beliefs, right? So these are beliefs about which arguments can be produced for and against those beliefs. And so we all know by this point, if we think about it, that Peter Pan is mistaken, right? If Never Never Land exists as an actual place, it doesn't exist just because I believe it really hard, right? Or with a lot of conviction, right? So they are reasoned beliefs. Believing the proposition doesn't make it true on its own, right? So we're going to look at what kinds of reasons for and against various non-empirical beliefs can be given. Not all of them. It's just introduction to philosophy class. We could take one philosophical issue and spend the rest of our lives looking at all the arguments, right? We're going to do it in a much more restricted and introductory way. And then these are beliefs that have universal importance. Even if you're not particularly interested in the question of free will or the mind-body problem or whether or not any supernatural beings exist, those are questions that are relevant to you as a human being that thinks and is likely to have, at least implicitly, some attitudes or beliefs about those sorts of things, right? So philosophy is important to me, even if I'm not interested in philosophy, because I'm a thinking thing, right? I'm a reasoning being. In the same way that even if I'm not interested in biology, here's an empirical example again, even if I'm not particularly interested in biology, biology is interested in me. It's relevant to me because I'm a biological being, right? And so by engaging in this, by attempting to remove and discern and remove these contradictions, and we'll talk more about what that means to remove a contradiction a little bit later on and in the first part of the class more thoroughly, we can have a better idea of our place in not just the world understood as a physical place, but certainly including that, but also the world of ideas. And so when I refer in the class from here on out to the textbook or technical definition of philosophy, this is the definition that I have in mind. This one from Classic Questions, the textbook that I often use, and that you've probably been assigned, even if you're in my ethics course, you've probably been assigned a portion of that first chapter from that book. And so here we have then some more information about the academic discipline of philosophy. And so what is it that you can expect to be doing in this class? Well, I'm concerned that you learn about influential philosophers, even if they're just historically influential, right? The ideas that have shaped and developed and contributed to the development of our own society and culture, and of course, cultures all over the world. Some people think philosophy has nothing to do with their lives, but if you're interested in living in a free society, well, there are political philosophers that have contributed to those notions. The idea that underwrites our own kind of social contract in American constitutional government, that notion of inalienable rights, John Locke contributed to the development of that idea. He was a philosopher. So there are philosophical ideas that underwrite or are presupposed in one way or another, any kind of form of government. And so these are ideas that are about culture, politics, laws, morality, religion, things that tend to matter to people, often things that people consider a part of their identity, and a part of that makes it difficult to do philosophy because oftentimes when you read an argument against something that you believe, you take it as a personal attack, but we're going to try and look at things more logically and impartially, right? It's one of the things that makes doing philosophy hard, or studying philosophy hard, so we tend to take things personally, and we need to learn to look at the evidence and think about them logically rather than emotionally. And we'll talk more about that later on too as well. But these are things that matter to us, right? That's my point for the moment. These are things that matter to us. Sometimes you might hear people, or maybe even you yourself, think that this is a ridiculous discipline. You shouldn't even have to take it in college or any of those sorts of things. But that's really an odd thing if you think about it. These issues of law, culture, society, religion, and morality, those are things that probably matter to you in some way or another. And so the idea of denigrating or dismissing a discipline in which the practitioners of that discipline spend their professional lives or large parts of their life having thought about them and worked out and developed very intricate theories and arguments for those theories, to denigrate that seems kind of odd, right? To be dismissive of it seems kind of odd. Why would we be dismissive of an academic discipline that focuses on investigating the issues that tend to make life worth living, right? And that matter to us as individuals and as a society. Right? And so studying philosophy can help us develop those critical thinking skills. It can help us develop our reading comprehension skills. Certainly central to doing philosophy is distinguishing good logical reasons versus bad reasons. And even if you never worry about distinguishing those sorts of arguments, bad arguments versus good arguments, being able to distinguish those, being able to produce them to support your own position on a matter, that's an important skill to learn. So even if you never worry about the free will again, or God's existence again, or some abstract problem about moral theory again, you're likely to have to argue with somebody over something important in your life. And the sorts of skills you learn in this could come in very handy there. Even if we never resolve once and for all some perplexing philosophical issue, we still develop, through studying those issues and the arguments that are developed for and against them, we still develop the logical reasoning and critical thinking skills that are needed for us to address less difficult to solve problems, right? I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I had a dispute with an insurance company. They didn't want to cover something. It was a dental insurance. They didn't want to cover something, but in my policy, it said that it should be covered. And I used my philosophical and logical reasoning skills to show them that they were wrong and that they ought to cover that according to our agreement. An argument that I had to have with someone, it's not as difficult of an argument to develop or formulate as one over free will or God's existence or objective moral truths, but the skills that I developed studying and learning about and how to produce arguments regarding those more difficult issues, those came in very handy in that instance. At the end of this semester, if you were going to dispute your grade and you came in and gave me what I consider bad reasons for it, you're not going to persuade me to change your grade. You're going to have to produce a good argument to persuade me to get me to do something, right? So studying philosophy can help us develop those sorts of things. Those are skills that are going to be useful for anybody, really. And I would argue that those are skills that are useful in order to maintain a free society. Even. I don't know about y'all, but I want to live in a free society. And if we're going to argue with one another about how to govern ourselves as a society, we need to be able to engage in principled arguments over what we should and shouldn't do, or how we should and shouldn't organize institutions and societies, rather than just in engaging in what I'll call mere rhetoric. And so here's some basic subfields of academic philosophy that we'll be looking at, not all of them, but we'll be looking at many of these in this class, especially on the basic subfield or basic area side here over on the left side. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to start off studying a little bit of logic. That's the study of proper reasoning. It is the more mathematical aspect of doing philosophy. Oftentimes people want to take a logic class in lieu of a math class because they don't like math, but the reason why they get credit for taking a logic class as a math credit is because there's a lot in common between those two things. So we'll learn about some basic argument forms and several informal fallacies. And again, the rules of reasoning that we're going to have to work with in this class. Although we're not going to learn all of them. It's not just a logic class after all. Right? And then we'll study a unit on epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. We'll be looking at a classical philosophical problem there, the challenge of skepticism. Can we have knowledge at all? Maybe it's the case that I'm living in a simulation, right? Or, and so how do I know about the external world, external to my own head? Well, it's through my senses, but my senses could be manipulated. So maybe a computer or some evil genius, or maybe aliens like in Rick and Morty, are manipulating me into thinking that I'm recording a lecture on an introductory lecture on philosophy, when really I'm a brain in a vat being fed experiences of giving a lecture. Right? Then we're going to look at metaphysics. Metaphysics in philosophy means the nature of reality. So what sorts of things exist versus don't exist. That's where we get into issues of free will. There's a political issue with regard to free will as well that's related to the metaphysical issue, but we're just going to look at the metaphysical issue here. Also issues about the nature of the human person. Are we all physical, or do we have an immaterial mind that is somehow related to our physical body? God's existence is a metaphysical question. The problem of faith versus reason is an epistemological issue that arises with regard to religion. Then there's moral and political philosophy. Both of those are concerned with justice. It's the overlap between them. How should I live? What ought I do? Those are ethical questions. How should we live? Right? What's the best form? What's the ideal form of society? There's a political question, basic question of political philosophy there. What is justice? Right? What is fairness? Just another everyday example here. You want me to treat you fairly. I want to be treated fairly. You certainly want me to grade you fairly. What does that mean? Then we have aesthetics, or the philosophy of religion. That's an area of philosophy that studies the nature of beauty and the nature of art. And then there's the history of philosophy. And in this class, we're going to look at many historical thinkers and a few contemporary thinkers. And then over here on the left, on the right, the right side here, under other fields, we have some other main subfields of academic philosophy, and some of those dovetail with the other main basic fields that I just mentioned. Any place, I mentioned the notion of a PhD degree earlier, any place where there's an area of study that raises non-empirical questions but doesn't typically investigate those questions itself, you get a philosophy of that area. So philosophy of science, how do we distinguish science from pseudoscience, or non-science, or hard sciences from soft sciences in a principled way? Most science classes don't take up that issue, but in the philosophy of science, that's exactly what you would study. Philosophy of mind is an area about that mind-body problem, right? Existentialism and phenomenology, two big philosophical movements that came out of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and still 21st centuries. Although existentialism proper is probably not really it's not dead, but it's not exactly a vibrant area anymore. Still very important and very interesting. If you studied philosophy, if you maybe read some, this happens a lot, so I'll mention it. A lot of people in high school might read in an English class like some existentialist philosophy and then get the idea that that's like what the whole academic discipline of philosophy is like. That's really not an accurate depiction of philosophy. That's one little area of philosophy. Many people might not study that at all in an introduction to philosophy class. There is a chapter that deals with some of those issues in your textbook, in Classic Questions textbook, but we won't be getting that to that this semester. But if you're interested in it, go look at that. You might have noticed that I'm got a backdrop here, a virtual background that's in Rick's garage from Rick and Morty. Existentialism is a major theme in that show. The meaning of life, the question of values is central to that show. And we're going to use a lot of Rick and Morty in this class. Your textbook uses some movies. In my lectures, I'm going to use some various aspects of pop culture, but I'll use Rick and Morty a lot too, because it's just such a rich show for introducing philosophical themes and ideas. And then here's some examples of philosophical questions, right? And again, notice that these sorts of questions can be distinguished by some of those basic subfields that we just went over. So epistemology, how do we distinguish between genuine knowledge and truth and mere opinion? We need a principled way of doing that. What justifies a belief as knowledge, right? What is the nature of truth? There are different theories of truth, for example. Metaphysical question, one of the basic ones is how, if at all, do we distinguish between appearance and reality? And how could we know there's the epistemological angle to it? How do we know what's real? How does the mind relate to the body? Mind referring there to a non-physical thing. Is morality objective or subjective? What is the correct standard for making moral decisions, for distinguishing between permissible, prohibited, and obligatory actions? Are practices like abortion, stem cell research, etc. permissible, or are some of those always prohibited? What's the nature of justice? What is freedom? What are the limits of freedom, right? The justifiable limits of freedom, such that the government can restrict my action in some way without doing wrong to me, without violating my rights. What makes a political authority legitimate? Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and there are all sorts of people running around arguing about whether mask mandates are a legitimate government mandate. It's a political question. It presupposes that we have some answer about the proper limits of governmental authority versus individual freedoms. So those are central questions in political philosophy. Chapter 8 is on that stuff again. Because we're doing stuff online, we're covering even less material than I normally would, but if that's a topic you're interested in, have at that chapter. It's a good chapter on that stuff. Or it's a good introductory chapter on that stuff, rather. Those sorts of questions. And then what is beauty? Is it objective or all in the eye of the beholder? What makes artwork genuinely art, right? You go into a modern museum, some of it looks like, scribbles with crayon on it. What is it that makes that art, really, as opposed to not art? Is it just that it's hanging in a museum and somebody's charging $4,000 for it? What is it that makes art art, in other words? So those are some basic philosophical questions and the basic subfields. Again, we won't have time to cover all of them, but those are some of the ones that are central to academic philosophy, the basic areas or subfields of academic philosophy. And so now let's take a little snippet of a look at what it means to do philosophy. What does it mean to think philosophically? So let's consider a claim. Let's call it the relativist thesis or the relativist claim. And here's a statement of that relativist claim. It's the thesis that there are no universal truths. All right, so I've got it in quote marks here. So that's an assertion. Sometimes that you hear people express that belief, or maybe you hear them express it a different way, that all truths are relative, right, to the individual, or maybe to particular cultures or something like that, or particular groups. So you might hear people talk that way from time to time, or maybe you think that way from time to time. And so let's take a look at this claim. Let's consider it philosophically. And so earlier I mentioned how I might define philosophy as the critical, reflective, and analytical inquiry and attempt to address fundamental questions of the human condition. Well, here's a question. Are there any universal truths? And here's an assertion. There are none, right? And so if you think about it in terms of the textbook definition, we would have there are no universal truths and there are some universal truths. There would be a contradiction, right? You can find people who argue both of those, right? So we've got an apparent contradiction there. So here's our claim. Let's consider one part of that contradiction. There are no universal truths. Well, let's ask ourselves some questions. So I mentioned philosophy's critical, reflective, and analytical inquiry into these sorts of non-empirical issues. Well, here's a critical question. Does that claim assert a truth? It's actually a reflective question as well. It's about the claim itself and what it implies about itself, right? Yes or no, right? Does that claim assert a truth? Well, declarative statements in English, on the face of it, all of them assert a truth claim, at least. They make an assertion, right? Yeah, that claim asserts a truth, or a truth claim anyway. And notice I'm saying assertion here. A proposition proposes a truth or declares a truth, and then that statement could be either true or false, right? Or maybe we don't know one way or another, but it certainly could be either true or false, right? And then another question, does that claim assert a universal or particular claim? Yes or no? Well, universal claims are claims like all or no or none, and particular claims are some and some are not. We see right away that this is a universal claim that asserts that there are none or there are no universal truths, right? And so it looks like we get two affirmative answers there to those questions about that initial claim, right? So here's what doing philosophy is like. Let's look at this here. So recall the claim that we're considering. There are no universal truths. Now, for the sake of argument, Aristotle has this line. Aristotle's a philosopher. He has this line about a mark of an educated mind is being able to entertain, right, to consider a view without necessarily endorsing it. And that's a lot of what we're going to be doing in this class, right? So let's assume for the sake of argument that this claim is true. What else, if we assume that it's true, what else has to be true? What does it imply or assume is also true? Well, it doesn't take much to see this, right? It's a pretty straightforward example of this kind of thing. If we assume that that claim is true, then the truth of that claim also logically implies the truth of another claim, that there are some universal truths, right? Because that claim itself is asserting a truth claim, and it's a universal claim, right? Given our two answers to those two questions on the previous slide. But there we see a problem pretty much right away. It can't be the case that both there are no universal truths is actually true, and that there are some universal truths is also a true statement. Those are contradictory statements. So we see that there's a problem there, right? We see a pretty bad problem there. So one more time, let's do it a different way here, right? So since we should be now that assuming the truth of there are no universal truths generates a contradiction, and contradictory statements cannot both be true, we know that the original claim has to be false, right? So if there are no universal truths is false because it's self-contradictory, it's assuming the truth of that claim is what generated the contradiction, and we know that contradictions can't be true. It's one of the basic laws of logic. I would say a basic law of common sense as well. Then we know that the opposite claim has to be true, right? So, as I say here, if there are no universal truths is false, because it's self-contradictory, it violates the law of non-contradiction, then we know that the opposite claim, there are some universal truths, is a true statement itself, right? We might not know what all those other universal truths are. They may be very, very difficult to figure out, and they usually are, but we'd at least know that there are no universal truths is a false claim. So notice what we just did. We didn't disprove the relativist thesis with any kind of empirical or scientific experiment. We didn't make an observation of the world, form a hypothesis about the causes of that observation, and then run about testing that with other observations that based on an experiment that we designed to run using microscopes or some other way of observing the world, even if it's enhancing our own senses. We disproved it by considering what the statement logically implies about itself in this case. Notice I use the term self-contradictory. Sometimes we might say self-refuting. Your textbook will use the phrase self-defeating. A really fancy way to say it is self-referentially incoherent or logically incoherent. You can use those phrases to impress people at parties, right? So we disproved it by looking at what that statement implies and assumes, logically speaking, about itself. When we assume the truth of that original statement for the sake of argument, right? So the content of that claim, of the relativist thesis, implicitly assumes the truth of the exact opposite of what that statement expressly or explicitly states. It's an example of a self-contradictory or self-defeating, or any of those other ways I just mentioned, claim, right? That's one way that we can start to resolve contradictions between non-empirical beliefs. So we've got this one belief, there are no universal claims. On the other hand, there is the assertion that there are some universal claims. Well, we looked at the first one, saw that it generated a contradiction. So if it generates a contradiction, it has to be false. So I resolve that contradiction by logical analysis in favor of the claim that there are some universal truths. All right, so if you don't get that right away, don't worry about it too much. You're going to have a reading assignment, actually a couple of reading assignments that walk through that kind of thing a couple of different ways on a couple of different topics. And then we'll also add to that some other ways in which arguments might fail, right? One way an argument might fail is if it has a self-defeating conclusion or a self-defeating or self-referentially incoherent premise. Other ways involve fallacies or invalid arguments. We'll learn about all that stuff in the first unit. So if you don't get that stuff right away, don't worry about it too much. Just giving you a little glimpse of what is involved in philosophical thinking there. And then here we conclude with one last way of thinking about what philosophy is here. So if you've ever seen the Colbert Report, which is pretty old now, he has a different show. He's on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert now, but he used to have this show on Comedy Central where he played this pundit character. And in the very first episode, he talked about truthiness. And off camera, in interviews, he said that it was basically a thesis for the whole show. And by truthiness, he meant really what people want to believe or do believe, but independent of evidence and logic. Right? So we could think of philosophy and doing philosophy as the examination of truthiness, what we would like to believe, right, in service of trying to figure out what's actually true, right? And so we've done a little bit of that here today, and the rest of the semester we will do a lot of that. So that's the basic spiel I have for the What is Philosophy lecture. Couple of last concluding points here that you might be worried about. So can philosophy solve the problems that it addresses? That's a question many students have. Well, the way we're going to do things, I mean, we've already seen, I think, one example of solving one philosophical problem, the problem of relativism. Most philosophical problems are not that simple. And what we're going to do in this class is we're not going to try to solve philosophical problems once and for all. That would be a ridiculous goal to have in an introduction to philosophy class. It would be an introduction. It would be a ridiculous idea to try to prove once and for all the theories of any particular discipline in an introductory class. That's not what we do in introductory level courses, right? We just introduce the disciplines, and that means usually introducing some of the main theories. And so that's what we'll do here. So I mentioned here that many philosophical issues do not have solutions the way that many simple math problems do. Of course, we know that many math problems don't seem to have solutions either. We typically don't think that the fact that some difficult math problems don't have solutions as a reason for dismissing the whole discipline, no, right? Philosophical problems are pretty hairy. A basic philosophical problem might get raised in different historical ways based on new information, right? So for example, in the 18th century, the problem of free will that we'll look at, the argument against free will that we'll look at was based on 18th century physics. Well, we don't have 18th century physics anymore, but today we might worry about the problem of free will with regard to some findings from neuroscience, right? So it's hard to solve these things once and for all in that regard. Generally speaking, in a philosophy class, what you're going to do is study particular aspects of ongoing matters of controversy. That's a lot of what we do in academic philosophy is they are controversial issues, but nevertheless, they are matters about which you can have better and worse arguments or better and worse views. More reasonable versus less reasonable views. So you need to get past this idea that because there's disagreement means it's just anything goes, right? And then lastly, what we should do is probably expect tentative results in an introductory class. Most of what we're going to be studying in this class, the way I do it, we're not even going to be studying for the most part the contemporary debates. We're going to be studying examples of historically influential arguments or historically influential thinkers from the past, right? Although we will look at some contemporary stuff along the way. One reason for doing that is because most of the arguments that we're going to look at, although historically influential in various degrees and in various ways, most of the arguments that we're going to look at, they all have problems with them. None of them, I won't say none, most of them are pretty bad in one way or another. And that's I'm picking that material on purpose because that's the kind of material that, although the errors of those arguments might not be obvious to you immediately or initially, there are problems with them, and that they serve as good source material for developing those critical thinking skills, right, that we're going to worry about here. And so if you have any questions, that wraps up this introductory lecture here. Be sure you do the reading assignments that were on the syllabus that go along with it. And if you have any questions about anything we covered in those reading assignments or in this lecture, feel free to post those in the discussion forum or bring them up in the next live Q&A session that we'll have at the end of this unit. I'm always available during office hours and by email to answer questions as we go. And I really want to encourage everybody, given that we're working in pandemic conditions, to make sure that you are taking advantage of the opportunities that you have to get help from me before it's too late to get help from me. Before the assignments, I'm here to help you. After the assignments, I'm here to evaluate you. So you need to make sure and get help with the material beforehand, not after, right? And that pretty much does it.
That's all, folks.